All right, good morning, everyone. So, like I just said, we're going to be in 1 Samuel 9. We're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 9. We're actually going to jump around. We're going to be in chapter 10, chapter 13, and chapter 15 today. But who has ever heard of the saying, don't judge a book by its cover? Right? It's a fairly common, don't judge somebody before you know who they are. And it can be hard to avoid to make judgments on other people, right? And it's all too easy to know the difference between, all right, I think this person is this person, and they turn out to be someone completely different than who they are. So in the Old Testament today, and we're still talking about villains, we're still talking about the bad guys in the Bible, and there's always a story, a backstory with that person, right? So for example, last week we talked about we talked about Cain and Abel. Cain was good. Cain gave his tithes to God. He did a sacrifice of all the. He didn't do the first, but he did his 10%. But it was out of the wrong heart. So therefore, that made him angry. He got jealous and he killed Abel. All right. So today we're going to look at Saul, and as we look at Saul, we see that Saul. As we look at Saul, we see that Saul at first he fit the part of a king. He was the person who looked the part, that knew what he was doing. In the chapter 9, it talks about Saul's being anointed as king, and as you go through here, Samuel towards the end of this, Samuel said, "But you're not. You're not going to be king." And as we read, I'm not going to read all 27 verses in chapter 9, but essentially, Saul does something good. He's the leader of the army. He comes and he's now the king, or he's being anointed king, which means he is stepping up into that kingship. And then all of a sudden, Saul goes, "That's not how this works." And in part of that story, God told Saul, "Hey, you need to kill everyone of I think it's the Ammonites. You need to kill everyone there. The king, women, children, all the livestock, and then burn everything. Don't take none of it," right? But he didn't do that. Saul was like, "I'm not going to kill the king. I'll just make him my prisoner. I'll let my soldiers go through, and they'll take what they want to because they lost so much in this war, right?" So he didn't follow God's command, and therefore God sent Samuel to tell him, "Hey, you're not going to be king. A king is coming." And as you know, as we go through here, Samuel took the flask of it. This is the story of Samuel took the flask of oil, poured it on Saul's head, kissed him, and said, "Hasn't the Lord anointed your ruler over his inheritance? Today, when you leave me, you will find 2 men at Rachel's grave at Zelzah in the territory of Benjamin. And they will say to you, the donkeys you went looking for have been stopped, and now your father has been stopped. Being concerned about the donkeys, it is worried about you, asking, what should I do about my son?" So now that's Samuel coding and saying, "Hey, you're not going to be a righteous king. You're not going to be that righteous person. You're going to have to worry about the next one coming up, your son, essentially." So, and then as you go through here, we see Saul's failure in chapter 13, verses 8 through 14. It talks about how he didn't kill all those soldiers. He didn't turn around and he didn't kill the king. He didn't kill everything that God told him to destroy. Instead, he let it back into his kingdom. So in chapter 15, you start to see that we all know how this story goes, and David came along, and David's brothers in the army. So he goes and he takes David to kill Goliath. So Saul's like, "Oh man, he's going to be a great leader." But it was at that point right there that God begins to see, or that Saul begins to see, that he's losing track, or he's losing his kingdom. So as you look at it, when who feels like you've tried to do something, you've tried to impress somebody, a parent, a family member, and then all of a sudden it turns around and somebody comes along and does it 3 times as better as you could ever do, right? That's essentially what's happened here. Saul, up until this point, had been the person who was showing, had been the person who had showed the people, hey, I'm the leader. I'm the one who's in charge. I'm the one who's done the right thing. I'm a righteously good guy. And he fit the stature, right? Kings were tall. He was the tallest person of his time. He was strong. He was the strongest person in the area. Then David comes along, some scrawny little nobody like Zach, and he kills. You have a good ending to the story, Zach. You're scrawny, but you kill the bad guy. Okay. So David comes along, and he's trying to feed his brothers, and he sees Goliath out in the field, right? So, and this is what Samuel was referring to in chapter 10, verses 2, is like, what should I do about my son? What are you going to do about him? Because he's going to come and he's going to impress the people even more. So all the hard work that you have done up until this point, that was the Israelites. They realized at that point that David was the true leader and it wasn't Saul. So I don't know when it comes to how this affects our life, when it comes to thinking about the villain in our life, have you ever felt like you've kind of got passed over, that all the work that you've put in hasn't been seen or hasn't been acknowledged, right? Or you feel like that, you know, you're the struggling sibling and, you know, your brother or your sister does something just 10 times better than you, and there's nothing that you can do to fix it. That's essentially how Saul felt. That's how Saul felt right here. Saul felt like that no matter what he did, especially after that scenario, no matter what he did, it was always going to end negatively for him. So how does that end in our story here? Well, we all know that Saul essentially tried to kill David. He knew David was the next king. He knew Samuel had left him to go out and to anoint him. And, you know, David did everything right. He was in the cave with him alone, and David chose not to kill him. David warned him, I'm not going to kill you. I'm not going to slaughter you. He just wanted to be friends. But Saul, on the other hand, he knew that he had to get rid of David to be the true king of Israel. And we see that David became king and Saul eventually died. So Paul tells us in Ephesians to be angry, but do not sin. Be angry and do not sin. Do not let us go down. Do not let the sun go down on your anger and give no opportunity to the devil. Many times in this story, Saul sat there and Saul looked at what David did that was better than him. Saul was mad that everything that he had done for the Israelites up until this point was like, oh, it never happened. I guarantee you there's some of y'all in here today, or some of y'all that are watching, that y'all have done something that no one realized that you ever did. And don't get angry and don't get frustrated about it, because the truth always comes out. People are always going to go look back and be like, oh, that got done. That was very good, whether they give you the praise or not. Even though Cain committed an act of murder, God didn't seek revenge on Cain. God did not kill him in judgment. Instead, God cursed Cain. So, and Paul also tells us in Ephesians that, you know, we don't need to practice our anger. We don't need to practice sin. You don't need to go out and attempt to be angry. So what I'm trying to tell y'all today, and what I'm going to encourage y'all as we get into our questions, is in our anger, we can destroy those around us and destroy our relationships with God. But anger is an inner emotion that can lead to harmful outward words and actions. I am in the wrong section. While Saul looked like a right fit for the king, ultimately he was arrogant to God's commands. Choosing to disobey and do things his way, we can choose to ignore God and become the villains in our own lives, arrogantly clinging to our titles and our abilities. So as you go through and as we start to get into these questions and things like that, remember that God's been trying to show you something. God's been trying to tell you something. Even though Cain killed Abel, God did not act out of anger. God did curse Cain, but God didn't give him this pain that he was dealing with. So, for example, for y'all, whatever y'all are going to, don't go out and try to make somebody else look bad because you didn't get acknowledged for something that you did. Go out and do the right thing continuously, and it will be eventually seen. All right, so let us pray, and then we'll get into our questions. Lord, I just want to thank you for all the many blessings you pour upon us, Lord. I want to thank you for just giving us a place to come and grow in our knowledge of you. I pray that as we step forward and we start to grow in our knowledge and we start to glorify your kingdom, Lord, I pray that we're listening to the commands that you're giving us, that we're not trying to be the villains in our own story, that even though we know that you will ultimately give us our ultimate decision, that we choose wholeheartedly to follow you and to follow your command. Lord, I love you with everything that you do. In your heavenly name I pray. Amen. All right, so questions.